Friends, thank you for joining us again for the Department of Medicine academic lunch today. Today's topic is management of ACS, an update. It's acute coronary syndrome. Now, science is moving at such a rapid rate that keeping touch with what's happening, even for physicians, is difficult. And even cardiologists may wonder how to keep pace with the things which are going on. We're very grateful today to have Dr. Nathaniel Sampson. He's a cardiologist in CMC Vellore. He's our MBBS, MD, and DM cardiologist, and a good friend of mine, neighbor. Very thrilled, so thrilled that he has accepted our invitation, and very grateful, Nathaniel. Thank you. Before we start, I must also thank the team from telemedicine who have faithfully been helping us, and Dr. Mohan, of course, who has really been the rock of our academic online programs and recording and sharing it on. So, as usual, we'll have the academic talk for maybe 40 minutes to 1 hour. And after that, please ask as many questions as you like. Send them in by chat function through the WhatsApp group, and Dr. Nathaniel will answer questions at the end of it. So, during the talk, keep your questions written down, maybe even start sending the questions in as you get them, and the questions will be answered at the end of the session. If you have again topics that you'd like covered by the Department of Medicine of interest, please mail us or visit our website or our YouTube channel. If you missed this or you want to share it with friends, probably in a week's time, this lecture will also be available on our department's YouTube channel. So once again, I'm deeply thankful and honored that Nathaniel accepted our invitation. It's a lovely thing to have him here with us, and it's going to be an academic feast for the next 40 minutes to 1 hour. Thank you, Nathaniel.
Friends, very good afternoon to all of you. It gives me immense joy and pleasure to be here addressing all of you from various parts of the country, and greetings to you from the Department of Cardiology, CMC Vellore. I would like to record my thanks to Dr. Tambu for giving me this opportunity, and the Department of Medicine for calling me in to give a talk like this, to Dr. Mohan for helping me out with the technical issues, and to the telemedicine department. I do want to put a few things in perspective before I start. As you can understand, the audience is quite heterogeneous, and my talk is going to be an update on the management of acute coronary syndrome. So there may be parts of the talk where certain subsets may feel it's irrelevant, or it's too interventional, or of those kind of things. So please bear with me. I only ask you for your forgiveness upfront. And without much delay, I'd like to proceed. So I have outlined the talk like this. We have to go through the universal definition of MI before we know how we manage acute coronary syndromes. That is vital. It's getting updated every now and then. We're going to go then into the guidelines for the STEMI and the NSTEMI management. We should remember that guidelines are only guidelines. They have their own pros and cons. And we're going to see which of those we can apply in our setting and which of those we cannot. And then we're going into a little bit of detail about the management of ST elevation MI in terms of the how to diagnose and what are the reperfusion strategies, what are we going to do on a long-term basis for the patient, and what are the possible complications, and very briefly about non-ST elevation acute coronary syndrome. The universal definition of myocardial infarction, this is a conjoint statement which was brought about by the European Society of Cardiology and the American College of Cardiology in 2018 actually, which says that the definition of MI denotes that there is presence of two things. One is acute myocardial injury, which is detected by cardiac biomarkers, and there is the setting of acute myocardial ischemia. Now both of these are very important. And they are very important because we have identified now a lot of diseases or a lot of conditions where patient presents with an acute myocardial injury, but there is no evidence of myocardial infarction. So we say that there is elevated troponin levels above the 99th percentile of the upper reference limit, but there is no evidence of ischemia in these patients. So we're going to label them as myocardial injury patients. Now they could have just presented from the community, or they could have presented as a result of a cardiac procedure, for example, a percutaneous intervention, angioplasty, or a CABG. Now, this is a slide which just tells us about the rise and fall of the troponin level. Down here, the green line represents the level below the 99th percentile of the upper reference limit. And so we have the troponin elevation, which normally goes up like that, okay, and rapidly rises and then comes down very steadily. This is the reason why we always have the term rise and fall included, the phrase rise and fall included in the definition of MI. Okay, so we pick up the patient here, and then a couple hours down the line, we're going to see a rise. We're going to pick up the patient here, we're going to see a fall. Nevertheless, we must understand that the fall may be very gradual, so we may see it only over a prolonged sampling as opposed to a rise which may be seen very quickly. We also see this dotted line here, which denotes that the troponin levels are actually high above the 99th percentile of the upper reference limit, but there is no sudden change. So these are conditions where there is chronic myocardial injury, where the troponin levels remain elevated over a period of time. So we have three spectrums here. So there are two circles which you can see and an area outside the circle. This area outside the circle is where there is no myocardial injury. Then there are so many incriminating factors which produce increased troponin elevation, which is the myocardial injury here. When that is combined with evidence of acute myocardial ischemia, then we call it as myocardial infarction. So how do we interpret it? This is just a flow chart reiterating the same thing. If the troponin levels are elevated but remain stable, we'll go to the right side part of the flow chart, then it indicates chronic myocardial injury. If there is a rise or fall, then there are two possibilities. With ischemia, we go down the acute myocardial infarction cascade. Without ischemia, we go down to the acute myocardial injury cascade. Right. So I'm just going to mention about the type 1 and type 2 of myocardial infarction according to the universal definition of MI. The type 1 is what we are all familiar with. It's the traditional MI which is caused by a plaque rupture or a plaque erosion. It's caused an occlusive thrombus or a subocclusive or a non-occlusive thrombus where flow is still preserved. Here flow is not preserved. So here the baseline, we need to all know that there has to be a rise and fall of a rise or fall of troponin level with any of these. Okay, symptom of myocardial ischemia, new ECG changes, development of Q waves, imaging showing loss of viable myocardium, or an angiogram or autopsy showing coronary thrombus. Type 2 is which is an MI which is not related to atherosclerosis. So essentially there is various conditions which can produce this. An oxygen supply demand mismatch which essentially produces. So we have the rise and fall of troponin, we have the symptoms, we have ECG changes, we have the Q waves, we can have loss of viable myocardium, but we do not have the fifth point, which is seeing thrombus in the coronaries, either with an angiogram or an autopsy. Okay. So now type 2 can have so many conditions. I'm not going to go into the details. This is just to impress upon everybody that there are so many conditions which can produce type 2 MI, not just an infection or not just anemia. There are so many other conditions which can produce a type 2 MI. So what I've said so far is summed up in this. It's just that myocardial injury has been brought into the fourth universal definition of MI as opposed to myocardial infarction, which needs to be differentiated. The type 1 and type 2, type 1 is associated with atherothrombosis and type 2 is not associated with atherothrombosis. We're not going to commandments 5 to 10. It relates to the type 3, type 4, type 5 of MI. So now I'm going on to ST elevation myocardial infarction. Why is ST elevation myocardial infarction so important? Now, if you just carefully look at the slide talks about a flow chart. This is classically called as the ischemic cascade. With time, there are all these new events happening, right? When the moment the vessel gets occluded with thrombus, okay, there are flow maldistribution. There is a flow maldistribution or flow pattern abnormalities, okay, resulting in hypoperfusion. The first thing to set in, which we probably be able to pick up with an echocardiogram, would be diastolic function abnormalities, diastolic dysfunction. Then comes the systolic dysfunction, and then usually the ECG changes, and finally angina. So when the patient is presented to us with chest pain, the patient has already gone through so much of pathophysiology, and we're already starting at a slightly backward kind of a start. We don't have a head start here. Now, I'll show you a diagram where there is evolving MI here. Now the ischemia, the green part is actually where the ischemia has already set in. This part is infarcted. The yellow part is ischemic but not yet infarcted. Now with time progression, the infarction which has started in the subendocardial layer of the myocardium gradually progresses towards the subepicardium, and finally the infarction is complete here. Now the jump in the myocardial infarction amount of the myocardium is maximum in the early hours, and thereon it is very gradual, which is the reason why we are so keen to catch these patients early and give them the required treatment early. Yet another diagram. Here we have plotted the time from symptom onset over here in hours and the amount of mortality reduction on the y-axis. Now what is our aim? Our aim is actually to move the patient from point A to point B or point B to point C. If we are going to move the patient from point D to point C, we are only going to produce more harm. We will want to catch them early and give them the treatment early. Alright. Once we make a diagnosis of STEMI, our decision is to reperfuse. So how are we going to diagnose it? We're going to look at symptoms of myocardial ischemia. They can be typical or atypical symptoms. Typical chest pain, central chest pain, heaviness, which radiates to the arm, jaw. These are typical. There are some patients who present with atypical features, as we know, dyspnea, sometimes just fatigue, palpitations, syncope may be the only presentation of MI. Okay, most often there are many who practice giving GTN for pain relief as soon as the patient comes in. Now sometimes the GTN might actually take away the pain immediately and the ECG changes may revert. Now that is not to be used as a diagnostic clue because some people do use it. However, we should remember that that does not mean that the insult is gone. Once the ECG is normalized, we have to closely monitor the patient and advise an early angiogram to see what exactly is happening. Now, ECG monitoring for patients, as soon as we have made a diagnosis of ST elevation MI, we have to monitor the ECG. As we all know, the earliest deaths in the first few hours of MI is due to arrhythmias, which can be picked up only because of ECG monitoring. If we do have a patient who is presented with chest pain, and we suspect ischemia, but the ECG is equivocal, we are not really convinced that there are significant changes, then we need to repeat ECGs at least at 10 minutes intervals, 2 to 3 ECGs to see if there is any evolution of changes, because the patient may have presented very early, which is why the ECG changes are not evident. Or the other possibility is that the patient is having some sort of an occluding and a relieving kind of a thrombosis where the myocardium is actually getting perfused intermittently. Right. So we all need to know how to risk stratify these patients so that we can explain the treatment, the urgency of the treatment, the prognosis, and the long-term outcome for these patients. This is just the TIMI risk score, which you can find in any standard book. It just shows that as the score progresses from 0 to 8, the mortality at 30 days steadily increases. Then there is GRACE risk score, which is also available online, which also uses certain parameters, and more than so we have to be familiar with any one of these risk stratification scores so that we can tell our patients how sick they are and what kind of treatment they require. Coming to the ECG abnormalities per se, I'm sure people have all read this somewhere, but just to go through it because it's important. In leads V2 and V3, we require just a 0.1 millivolt of ST elevation. That is 1 millimeter ST elevation minimum. Okay, in all other leads, in all other leads except V2, V3, we need a 0.1 millivolt ST elevation. Whereas in V2, V3, it depends on age and sex cutoff, as it is shown there. And the least is for women of any age, and the highest required ST elevation is for men who are less than 40 years of age. This is because younger people more likely to have early repolarization abnormalities which can mimic ST elevation, J point elevation. So to improve the diagnostic accuracy, we have these cutoffs. If it's ST depression, then we look for a minimum of 0.05 millivolt ST elevation, that is 0.5 mm ST elevation, or a T-wave inversion, which is more than 0.1 millivolt in two contiguous leads with a prominent R. Now that is important. I'll show you some ECGs down the line, and there we will understand why it's important. Now this is in the absence of left bundle branch block or in the absence of LVH abnormalities on the ECG. If there is left bundle branch block, this is the traditional Garbosa's criteria which we all might have come across earlier. But the current recommendation does not really give it points as we see in this slide. So the current recommendation actually just says the concordant ST elevation is the most significant, which is what we see as points, as designated as 5 points. Now, for those who may not readily understand this, I put up an ECG of a patient who's got a left bundle branch block, and now I want to show you certain things in this ECG. Now we see that the QRS is predominantly negative. Okay, we look. This is a QRS complex, predominantly negative up till V4, and V5 and V6 we have a positive QRS. What do we mean by concordant and discordant? Concordant ST change is in the same direction as that of the QRS complex. For example, if we have an ST depression in this lead V3, the ST segment is on the negative side, the QRS is negative, so we call it as a concordant ST depression. So in LBPP patient, we expect any ST elevation here would be discordant, any ST depression in these leads up till V4 would be discordant, any ST depression would be concordant, and ST elevation in V5 and V6 would be concordant. Now the highest value goes to ST elevation in lateral leads, okay, where the QRS is positive, that is concordant ST elevation. The same thing here, where I want you to look at these two leads, the V5 and V6, where there is ST elevation, where we normally actually expect them to be like this, okay, without any elevation. So these are the atypical presentations. One we just discussed, the bundle branch block. Next is if a patient has come with a ventricular paced rhythm. Once again, the ECG, because we're going to pace the RV, the ECG is going to look like a left bundle branch block, right? We are going to pace from the RV. Normally, his Purkinje system carries the conduction forward. So we're going to pace the RV, so it's going to look like a left bundle branch block. So the same rules as that of LBPP ECG applies to these as well. Isolated posterior myocardial infarction can be sometimes difficult to, or easy to miss rather, which is usually picked up by looking at these ST depressions in the septal leads, V1 to V3 leads, which we usually do not find in a normal person, more than 0.5 millimeters of ST depression, and an accompanying ST elevation in the posterior leads, that is V7 to V9. So we are advised to do posterior leads as ECG recording when we do not find anything in the standard 12 lead ECG. And one more thing that we need to remember, this is a ST elevation equivalent, though we do not find ST elevation, that is ST depression more than 1 millimeter in 8 or more of the surface leads, along with ST elevation in AVR or with ST elevation in V1. This is left main equivalent, which indicates usually multi-vessel, severe 3-vessel ischemia. Right. Just put up a few examples of ECGs. Now here we can see that the ST segment is grossly elevated in the anterior leads, even up to V6, also involving 1 and AVL as well. Maximum ST elevation is in V3. We can ask the PGs, they're not there. Maybe difficult.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask some of the ECGs put forth to the medicine PGs, but maybe it's difficult, logistically not very easy. So here we see maximum ST elevation in lead V3, and we also see that the terminal part of the QRS is distorted. This is what we call as the grade 3 ischemia. Right, now this inferior leads 2, 3 AVF, which depict the inferior wall, have the ST elevation. These are not V1 to V6, these are right-sided leads. If you see that these are right-sided leads where V4R has got ST elevation. The V4R has got the maximum specificity to pick up a RV myocardial infarction. So when we have inferior lead ST elevation, we are always recommended to record RV leads and posterior leads. RV leads is V4, V5, V6 on the right side, and posterior leads is V7 to V9 on the back. Now this again shows ST elevation in inferior leads, but there is a certain difference between the previous ECG and this one. If you can see carefully, the Q waves is already set in, the ST has come down, and the T waves are inverted. Now this is an evolving inferior wall MI, as opposed to this is an acute inferior wall MI. A patient who presents with severe chest pain and this kind of an ECG is at grave danger, but very often it gets missed. For people who are not aware of or not seen this ECG in the past, essentially this ECG shows some features of right bundle branch block. If you can see that there is a tall R in V1, which is not normally expected, a wide S in V6, which again is not normally expected. So, but what is different from just an RBBP is that there are prominent Q waves from right here V1 to V3, and then there is ST elevation as well. This ST elevation may not be so obvious, which is why it is usually missed. So this is the QRBBMI, which denotes extensive anterior wall myocardial necrosis. Right. Now I put up this ECG to show an inferior wall MI in a patient with LBBP. So there is inferior leads ST elevation, and you can also note that the rhythm is irregular. This patient also has atrial fibrillation. Now, inferior leads, like I mentioned just a while ago, AVF is having ST elevation. So if we notice these ST depressions in V2, V3, which we don't normally expect, especially with an upright and tall R wave, we are suspecting a posterior wall myocardial infarction in this case. So this patient has got inferior and posterior wall myocardial infarction. This patient also may be passed off as pretty normal when they present with chest pain and with typical risk factors. But what we do notice here is in leads V2, V3 and V4, there is this ST depression with a very tall and upright T wave. Okay, this is the De Winter sign, which denotes a LED, proximal LED problem. Basically, it's almost like an anterior wall MI, the De Winter sign. So this is one thing that we should all, this pattern is something that we should all be familiar with. Right. Like I said earlier, if there is non-diagnostic ECG, we're going to repeat the ECG. There are some small subset of patients who may not have much ECG changes. For example, when the LCX is occluded or there is an occlusion of a vein graft in a patient who's undergone a CABG in the past. Sometimes left main disease, like I said earlier, multiple lead ST depression without any ST elevation, the presentation of left main or left main equivalent. Or isolated posterior wall MI also, we may miss ST elevation. So we need to be wary of these things. Going on to the management. So patient is come in. Now the first thing is traditional teaching is to give oxygen. Who do we give oxygen for and why? Oxygen is not recommended for every patient. It is only for patients who have a saturation of less than 90%. That is because there are trials, for example, the detox trial and the avoid trial, which have looked at patients who have received oxygen. And they have found that it doesn't really make a difference in the outcome if the saturation is more than 90%. And there are some patients who ended up having a larger infarct size when they received oxygen. So we do not give it when it's not recommended, that is less than 90%. Now morphine, patient is in severe pain, so we all want to give them morphine. We should give them morphine. It also relieves some amount of anxiety. It brings down the sympathetic tone, which decreases the afterload, and so many good things about it. We should also remember that multiple studies have shown that morphine significantly interacts with P2 Y12 inhibitors, the antiplatelet agents such as clopidogrel, ticagrelor, which patient is going to be receiving. So we should just be wary of that. So the initial part, small dose of morphine would be good, not to keep them on around-the-clock morphine as we do for other painful conditions. A small dose of benzodiazepine sometimes helps to relieve anxiety. So these are the general things that we might want to do for the patient. So like I said, oxygen is not for somebody who's got a saturation more than 90%. And opioids to relieve pain. I think the camera is... Thank you. Did we finish the previous slide? Yeah. This is not a very uncommon situation. A patient has been brought in saying that he had a cardiac arrest on the road. He was revived by somebody who gave CPR and then he's brought gasping. He's intubated in casualty. What do? We know that the first few hours after the onset of a myocardial infarction, most of the deaths are related to arrhythmia, ventricular fibrillation. So VT or VF. So we know that it's very common. So post arrest, if the ECG shows ST elevation, certainly they need to go for reperfusion. If there is a non-diagnostic ECG, but the suspicion of myocardial ischemia is very high, for example, patient had developed chest pain or other cardiac symptoms just before, and then he had collapsed. and he was well before that. These things suggest that it's possibly cardiac etiology. Once again, he needs to go for a reperfusion strategy. At the same time, we should also be very quick to make sure there's not possibly other cause, for example, a CNS bleed or something like that. Therapeutic hypothermia has to be initiated provided that does not delay reperfusion therapy. So the first and foremost is to make sure that the occluded vessel is opened up, and then we would proceed to institute therapeutic hypothermia. Now, this was new in the 2017 guidelines. We're all used to the term window period, door to needle, door to balloon time, and all these things. But certain terms were changed drastically in the 2017 guidelines. I want to point out to you these two lines here, the one on top and the one on the bottom. So the term window period is essentially gone. Now we have a few delays between the onset of symptoms and treatment. Now, what are the delays? The first is the patient delay, the time the patient takes to reach a point where he can get an ECG done and a diagnosis of ST elevation MI can be made. Now, in the West, they just have to call the emergency medical system and they will come and take the patient. Now, for us, the patient has to reach the hospital to have an ECG which is taken and interpreted. As of yet, our emergency ambulances do not take ECG and interpret them. So, until they reach the hospital, it's patient delay. Now, there's not much we can do in terms of therapy, but to decrease that, but we could increase awareness in our respective communities to seek medical attention as soon as possible once they develop symptoms. Now, when the patient gets an ECG done, okay, at this point in time, and ST elevation MI is diagnosed, that is called as FMC, which stands for first medical contact. So, if the patient has gone to another hospital before coming to us, the patient was told to have a possible MI, but ECG was not done, that would not be the first medical contact. Okay, patient has to reach a place where there is an ECG done and that has to be interpreted as ST elevation MI, and that becomes the first medical contact. From the time of the first medical contact starts the system delay. So this part is the system delay, which is what is there in our hands. But the total patient delay and the system delay forms the ischemic time as far as the patient is concerned. Right. So patient comes to, through the emergency service, he has come to either a center which has got capability of doing a primary PCI or a center which does not have primary PCI. Now let's look at the bottom one first because that's easy to deal with. So patient has come to a tertiary care center or a center which has primary PCI. The diagnosis of STEMI has to be made within 10 minutes of arrival of the patient. So within 10 minutes, ECG is taken, interpreted, STEMI diagnosis is made, PCI is possible in that center. The patient directly goes to the cath lab, gets an angioplasty done, and then perfusion is established by passing the coronary wire through the occluded coronary. Perfusion is established. The target for this is 60 minutes. If the patient reaches a center which is not capable of doing a PCI, then you are actually confronted with a question. The question is, if you were to transfer the patient to a center which can do a PCI, would it be less than or more than 120 minutes? So, if you are staying close to a center, if your center is close to a PCI capable center, then the recommendation is to transfer the patient for a primary PCI. Okay, so there is no initial treatment except for, let's say, oxygen or something. The general measures alone, and then you have the loading dose, of course, can be given aspirin, clopidogrel, atorvastatin, and then you're going to transfer the patient to a PCI capable center where they have to take less than 90 minutes to establish perfusion. So essentially, the travel time is indirectly limited to 30 minutes, so that the remaining 90 minutes is given to the system which is doing the reperfusion part. If you do not have a center close by where you can transfer such a patient, it's going to take more than 2 hours for him to get reperfused, then the recommendation is to do fibrinolysis. Okay, the time duration given to do fibrinolysis is only less than 10 minutes, which means the choice of agent is already decided. We'll come to that in a few slides. And then we have to shift the patient for a PCI capable center. So I have already explained these terms. First medical contact is where the STEMI diagnosis can be made. That means where an ECG can be taken and interpreted. If somebody taken an ECG but did not interpret it as MI, it still wouldn't amount up to a first medical contact, sadly. So this is STEMI diagnosis. The moment STEMI diagnosis is made, that's called a STEMI diagnosis. Then primary PCI is percutaneous intervention using a balloon or a stent or any other device to open up the occluded artery. IRA is the infarct-related artery. But there has been no fibrinolytic treatment given. Directly, patient has gone for a PCI. So that strategy is called a primary PCI strategy. A rescue PCI strategy would be somebody who's received fibrinolytic therapy but that has failed. Okay, we'll come to what failed is later. If the patient has received fibrinolysis but the patient has been successfully reperfused just with the fibrinolytic agent, the patient is supposed to go in for a PCI 2 to 24 hours from the onset of fibrinolysis. That is a routine early PCI after fibrinolysis. These both, the rescue and the routine, form the pharmacoinvasive strategy. So the moment this ECG shows the STEMI, there is something called the strategy clock which starts ticking. And there is only 10 minutes for us to decide if we are going to do a fibrinolysis at that point or we're going to refer him to another center. Now if our center itself is capable, then we're going to do reperfusion with primary PCI, otherwise lysis and refer. And the next center has got 90 minutes to establish perfusion. Now this part, the 60 to 90 minutes part, is the duration that is allowed for us to reassess and see with an ECG whether the fibrinolysis has worked. How do we do that? We take an ECG and look at the ST segment elevation. We look at the lead which had showed the maximum ST segment elevation in the first ECG and see how much it has come down. If it has come down by more than 50%, that is good ECG resolution. If it is less than 50%, that is not good resolution. Or if the patient has persistent chest pain, that also amounts to poor resolution, both of which require rescue PCI. Well, this is the same thing but extended up to 48 hours. So I'll go through it in parts. So this symptom has begun. In the first 3 hours, the patient requires an immediate reperfusion strategy either with the primary PCI or a fibrinolytic agent, both of which are equally good in the first 3 hours. The efficacy is as good. But 3 to 12 hours, primary PCI has still got a strong recommendation. Fibrinolysis, the effect of fibrinolysis starts to wear off or the efficacy starts to come down in this time gap between 3 to 12 hours. 12 hours to 48 hours, well, primary PCI is still the mode of reperfusion strategy, especially in patients who have hemodynamic instability or who continue to have chest pain or have some malignant arrhythmias, VT, VF. So we are going to send them again for primary PCI. But if they're asymptomatic, they go for primary PCI, but the level of recommendation is less. It's a class 2 recommendation, class 2A recommendation for primary PCI in this setting. After 48 hours, the patient has come to us and said, I had chest pain about 2 days ago, and we see that the ECG is showing, for example, an inferior wall MI. Now, we are not going to reperfuse these patients. We're going to manage them medically because there are numerous trials and some evidence which say that these people do not do any better treated with a PCI. Fibrinolysis, of course, is out of question in this setting because fibrinolysis cutoff is still 12 hours. Right. So like I said earlier, a reperfusion strategy, if primary PCI, it has to be done within 12 hours of symptom onset. That's got the highest benefit. If the PCI would be the reperfusion strategy if patient presents with MI and got a non-interpretable ECG, like for example, this is high suspicion with an ECG that is showing a pacing ECG or something that shows a LVBB. More than 12 hours, if the patient has ongoing ischemia in terms of ECG or pain or arrhythmias or hemodynamic instability, patient still has to go for a primary PCI. In 12 to 48 hours, asymptomatic patient, there is small amount of evidence to say that there is some benefit. Beyond 48 hours, OAT trial, this OAT trial is occluded artery trial, which showed that they actually took patients who presented after 3 days. They did an angiogram after 3 days of the MI and saw that that particular vessel in concern, the infarct-related artery, was occluded. Opening that did not increase or did not change the outcome significantly. So we do not treat them beyond 48 hours with primary PC. Just a picture to show. So this is a RAO cranial view, that is the right anterior oblique view of the left anterior descending artery. This is the best view to see the left anterior descending artery in full length. We see here that the artery is occluded. Okay, there is no flow here. So patient presented with an anterior wall MI, and the flow has been established. The patient has been stented. We can see that kind of a meshy appearance here, that is the stent, and flow is established now. This is an occluded right coronary artery in its mid part, a mid RCA which is occluded here. It's been stented and opened up. You can see good flow after PCA, primary PCA. I'm not sure how many of us have a cardiology background, but since it has been widely disseminated, I'll just briefly go through certain procedural aspects, probably very, very quickly. Primary PCI, radial versus femoral, there's plenty of evidence that radial is much safer. Femoral has much more complications, so access is radial, especially if the person is very experienced with radial access. Most of the West have quite a bit of femoral access still in vogue. Okay, stenting versus angioplasty. Angioplasty means without stenting, that's what I'm talking about. So stenting with the newer generation stents have shown to be having better outcomes compared to plain balloon angioplasty. Okay, deferred stenting, many people practice this. That is, they want to stabilize the patient. Okay, they do an angiogram and they want to stabilize the patient and then do the stenting later, maybe some 48 hours later or 72 hours later in the same, that's index hospitalization. Now, Dynami deferred trial showed that that is not beneficial. So stenting during the primary PCI procedure is what's beneficial. Thrombus aspiration is nothing but putting a small catheter within the coronary which is able to suck out the thrombus. Okay, that is not routinely recommended anymore. It used to be done very widely in the past, but it's not routinely recommended. Multivessel devasculation, that is, if a patient presents with anterior wall MI but also has significant coronary stenotic lesions in, for example, the RCA as well. As of now, and the traditional teaching has been to open up only the infarct-related artery and leave the rest for later. In fact, old-time teachers used to say that you have to rest the heart for 1 month or something and then do it. But current evidence says that it can be done in the index hospitalization, maybe not in the same procedure. So maybe 48 to 72 hours down the line, before discharge, the other lesions can also be stented. Now, pharmacotherapy, I'll just straight away go to this slide which tells us. For those who are undergoing primary PCI, the antiplatelet, so we have to remember that there are three things. There is antiplatelet agent, there is anticoagulant, and then there is intense lipid lowering therapy. These things have to be started initially, early on. So aspirin has to be started in everybody. Now we start 300 mg loading dose as soon as the patient walks into the chest pain unit. Clopidogrel is given for those patients who are undergoing primary PCI at a dose of 600 milligram, or if they are going to undergo thrombolysis, 300 milligram, followed by 75 mg per day. Now, prasugrel and ticagrelor are newer P2Y12 inhibitors. They are more potent than clopidogrel. They have a slightly higher risk of bleeding associated with them. So, those who undergo PCI, it is recommended to give prasugrel or ticagrelor instead of clopidogrel unless there are certain contraindications. For example, prasugrel is contraindicated in somebody who has had a stroke in the past or a DIA in the past. And in general, in elderly, more than 75 years of age, or if the body weight is less than 60, then they stand at higher risk of bleeding with prasugrel. So in these patients, we'll be very careful, and if there's a past DIA or stroke, we will avoid prasugrel. Anticoagulation, we have to give any of these agents. Now, I'm sure we all have access to unfractionated heparin or enoxaparin. Enoxaparin is one bolus dose, 0.5 mg per kg IV before the patient goes for a PCI. The heparin also has, am I audible? Yeah. Unfractionated heparin also has a bolus dose and then an infusion which is recommended. Now I'm moving on to the other arm. So we just dealt with the primary PCI arm. Now we're going to the fibrinolysis arm. Okay, the fibrinolysis plus minus the pharmacoinvasive strategy. Now, as I said earlier, we are going to subject somebody to fibrinolysis only if they cannot reach a PCI capable center within the next 120 minutes. A fibrin specific agent is recommended. So tenecteplase, retiplase or alteplase as opposed to streptokinase is recommended. There is significant difference in the potency between these agents. I'll show it to you in the next slide. Antiplatelet agents, they need, we're going to give them dual antiplatelets, that is aspirin plus clopidogrel for 1 year minimum. And anticoagulation, the same thing that I mentioned earlier, during the hospital stay. And it's important to remember that we are going to lyse the patient and reassess at 60 to 90 minutes if they have good resolution or not. Like I mentioned earlier, chest pain should have subsided completely, and ECG also should have more than 50% reduction in the ST elevation, which was evidenced in the maximal ST elevation lead in the baseline ECG. This is just a slide to show the difference in the patency rate. So these are 85% of the patients with STEMI who received tenecteplase had established reperfusion, or the vessel was patent, right? Very close is retiplase. The different studies which put the figure for alteplase is 73 to 84. The streptokinase is definitely behind, which is the reason why that is not recommended as the first drug of choice. The tenecteplase is one single injection, so it just takes one shot. So the duration, as I said earlier, lysis is only 10 minutes. So obviously they say that we have to do it with tenecteplase. Retiplase would be 2 injections given 30 minutes apart, and alteplase would be a 90-minute infusion. Streptokinase is usually a 1-hour infusion. We have to watch out for anaphylaxis, allergic reactions during the infusion. Right, so this is just to show that the different body weight actually requires different doses of tenecteplase, and in patients more than 75 years, it is recommended to reduce it to half the actual dose based on the weight. So this is because the studies which showed that tenecteplase initially had good reperfusion, but the benefit was offset because of the bleeding complications. And then when they amended this dose, they found that it was superior to streptokinase, and it was good fibrinolytic agent. Contraindications to fibrinolytic therapy, prior stroke of or intracranial hemorrhage, or stroke of unknown origin, or prior intracranial bleeding. If there was an ischemic stroke within the last 6 months, CNS malignancy, structural neoplasms, or arteriovenous malformations, recent major trauma or surgery, GI bleeding in the past month, patient is known to have a bleeding disorder except for menstrual bleeding. An aortic dissection patient, or somebody who's got non-compressible puncture in the last 24 hours, for example, if they had a liver biopsy, lumbar puncture, or a major any other major procedure. And these are the relative contraindications. I just want to mention about the blood pressure. Now, if the blood pressure is high when the patient comes in, it is advisable to start medication. That is, if we are going to fibrinolyze the patient, to start a medication that will drop the blood pressure. For example, GTN infusion. And when the blood pressure falls down to less than acceptable limits, then we can thrombolize the patient. Now, this is a graph which represents risk factors for increased risk of intracranial bleeding. Now, there are different studies which took different factors. I'm not mentioning the factors, except the 3 factors that were very common among all the studies were elderly, those with low body weight, or hypertension at admission. There are other factors which are studied, but it essentially shows the more number of factors, the higher the chance. So we can have a ballpark estimation of what the chance of intracranial bleeding is going to be like, and accordingly decide if fibrinolysis is too dangerous. Then we may withhold fibrinolysis in certain situations in these patients. So somebody who goes for fibrinolytic therapy instead of a primary PCI, this is what they will be receiving. The fibrinolytic agent would be tenecteplase, aspirin, the primary antiplatelet agent. The second one would be clopidogrel. We will not recommend prasugrel, ticagrelor in these patients because the risk of bleeding is high. However, after 48 to 72 hours, we can revisit the decision for more potent P2Y12 inhibitors like prasugrel and ticagrelor. And they all need to receive IV dose of enoxaparin, which is 0.5 mg per kg, followed by subcutaneous dose, which is twice daily, either until they go for PCI or until they are discharged. A word about emergency CABG. If the patient is gone for primary PCI, angiogram shows extensive multivessel disease, unable to revascularize the infarct artery. Emergency CABG is recommended, but there are caveats here. Now, people have studied the timing for emergency CABG, and they said that early CABG usually carries a lot of mortality because the risk of bleeding is high. Patient has just been loaded with a lot of antiplatelet agents and received plenty of anticoagulants. So they have traded off the benefit versus the risk and say that it would be wise to wait 3 days after the patient has been loaded with ticagrelor, or 5 days with clopidogrel, or 7 days of prasugrel to undergo a CABG procedure. However, aspirin should be continued when the patient undergoes a CABG procedure because of for a STEMI. Where am I going to keep this patient, and when am I going to feel comfortable to discharge the patient? All STEMI patients are required to be with ECG monitoring for the first 24 hours. So preferably CCU or a semi-ICU or some sort of a monitoring system area, not a bed where there is no monitoring available. Now, in the West, if suppose I'm a primary physician and I have sent a patient to a PCI capable center, if the patient is absolutely stable, it is recommended that they can transfer back the patient the same day. So if you are sitting in a peripheral setup, and if you do have such a PCI setup close by, patient can go get the primary PCI done. If the physician feels he is stable, he can be shifted back to your center. An early discharge is what is recommended, 48 to 72 hours after hospitalization. Unless the patient has had a very, very stormy course, patient has been in the ICU or intubated, or patient had cardiogenic shock, and unless otherwise, patient can go home after 48 to 72 hours. Of course, patient can be ambulated. If undergone primary PCI and stable, can be ambulated even on the same day. All right. What about patients who have already been on oral anticoagulation for other reasons? For example, patient had AF, was already on oral anticoagulation. So here, as I mentioned earlier, oral anticoagulation is a relative contraindication for fibrinolysis, so it is better that these patients undergo a primary PCI strategy, but preferably with only aspirin and clopidogrel and not the higher or more potent P2Y12 inhibitors. After the procedure is over, we need to sit and reassess if they really need oral anticoagulation or not. For example, if the decision was really required, if so, yes. Otherwise, we choose to stop them to be on oral anticoagulation. If they do need oral anticoagulation, then it is recommended to put them on triple therapy. Triple therapy means one is the anticoagulant, two is aspirin, three is clopidogrel for 6 months, and then followed by single antiplatelet plus oral anticoagulation. Many studies say that after 1 year we can remove all antiplatelets and give only the oral anticoagulant. When somebody requires triple therapy, what we usually do is to put them on triple therapy for a month and then switch over to clopidogrel plus the oral anticoagulant. When am I going to do echo for these patients? If the patient has come in the setting of shock or patient has suspected mechanical complication, for example, I have auscultated the patient and patient has got a pansystolic murmur in the left sternal border. I'm wondering if he's got a ventricular septal rupture as well, so I have to do an emergency echo for this patient. Okay, if the diagnosis is not certain, if the ECG changes are not very convincing, then once again I can do an emergency echo, but I should make sure that that does not delay the treatment the patient needs to receive. Post-procedure, patient is back in the CCU, patient is in shock, which was not there earlier. So that once again, that's an indication of emergency echo. Essentially, we're looking for any procedure-related complications, pericardial tamponade, those kind of complications. If the patient did not have an indication for emergency echo, then the patient can undergo routine echo after the PCI is over to look for the LV function, RV function, what is the damage of the MI, and so that serves as a baseline. If the LVEF was less than 40%, the recommendation is to repeat it after 6 to 12 weeks. All right, so the acute management is done, patient is ready to go. What are the medications that I would send this patient on long term? So we're just going to look at it under these headings. Antiplatelet agents, like I said earlier, if the patient has undergone a primary PCI, dual antiplatelet therapy for 1 year is what's recommended. If the patient has not undergone PCI, then we can give up to 12 months, but the minimum we need to give is the second agent for at least a month. The clopidogrel has to be given for at least 1 month. Then of course there is a DAPT study which came in 2014 which said that for those patients who've had stents, and they looked at patients who already completed 12 months of DAPT, and then they said that extending then that 12 months to 18 months reduced further ischemic events, but there was a small risk of increased bleeding. Lipid lowering therapy, now we all know that the evidence for secondary prevention for lipid lowering agents is very big. Now statin therapy can safely reduce the 5-year incidence of major coronary events, coronary revascularization and stroke by 1/5 per millimole per liter. Okay, for 1 millimole per liter for us would be nearly 40 milligrams per deciliter for us when we measure in our assays. So a 40 milligram reduction, okay, causes a drop in these major events by 20%. This is a large meta-analysis of about I think more than 50,000 patients. Right, so the goal is to reduce the LDL level to an absolute level of less than 70 or get a 50% reduction from the baseline. If that is not achieved with high intensity statin alone, then adding ezetimibe is indicated. That comes from the Improve It trial, where adding ezetimibe to high intensity statin further reduced LDL and caused improvement in some clinical outcomes. Now, PCSK9 inhibitor, evolocumab, it's prohibitively expensive. The evidence for that is, of course, from the Fourier trial. The drop was in terms of revascularization and ischemic events. There was not a significant drop in the all-cause mortality. That we need to remember. Just to differentiate what is high intensity, moderate intensity, and low intensity statin, we are recommended to give high intensity statin. We are talking about atorvastatin 40 to 80 mg, so moderate intensity would be atorvastatin 10 to 20. There is no low intensity atorvastatin. What about beta blockers? Now, beta blockers have 2 times when we give beta blockers. One is in the early phase, and one is for mid and long-term beta blocker treatment. In the early phase, people used IV metoprolol and found that there was significant reduction in all-cause mortality. Apologies for the typo. The COMET trial, for example, it included patients who received IV beta blockers early on. The problem was there was significant hypotension because of IV beta blockers, which so later when people decided to kind of see which are the patients who may not do well with IV beta blocker and took them out of the scenario, then the rest of them received early IV beta blockers and they did well. There was a reduction in the number of arrhythmias, which usually happen in the first few hours of MI, and they had better outcomes. So it is suggested that if patients are, if there is significant signs of heart failure or shock already, or if they're more than 70, systolic blood pressure is low, they have significant tachycardia, or they have presented late, then in these patients, beta blockers will not be initiated in the first 24 hours. We'll revisit the decision after 24 hours. But in all other patients, it should be initiated in the first 24 hours. And beta blockers should be continued during and after the hospitalization for all these patients, provided there is no contraindication. Okay. So, right. ACE inhibitors and ARBs are the other group of drugs which they need to be started on within the first 24 hours. There's a lot of evidence for that. So it is recommended for all patients with LV dysfunction, heart failure, hypertension or diabetes. Patients on who have hypertension anyway, ACE inhibitor is one of the first line drugs that is recommended. Mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, spironolactone. The trial evidence comes from EPHESIS, Reminder, Albatross. These are the trials. Reminder and Albatross specifically looked at starting aldactone very early, less than 24 hours of the onset of MI, and they found significant benefit for these patients. So it is recommended for all patients who have an LV EF of less than 40% in the setting of LV systolic dysfunction. What is the role of nitrates? Only two roles. One is for anginal relief, and the other is for setting of heart failure. The patient has significant heart failure. For example, patient presents with acute decompensated heart failure. IV nitrates, GT and infusion would be of much benefit to reduce the preload and the afterload. Otherwise, long-term treatment with nitrates is not recommended unless we are giving it for anginal relief. Calcium channel blockers are not routinely recommended even for anginal relief in MI. If the patient is not able to receive beta blockers for any reason, then at discharge we can consider starting non-dihydropyridine calcium channel blockers, verapamil or diltiazem, to reduce the heart rate instead of in those who cannot receive beta blockers. So I think all right, I'm just skipping these slides because I think we have dealt with this in detail. Just a few slides on complications that patients can develop in ST elevation MI. Myocardial dysfunction can present as LV dysfunction, can produce LV aneurysm. They can have LV thrombus because that part of the myocardium is not contracting well. So there is stagnation and there is thrombus which is formed. The patient develops LV thrombus. They are recommended to be on oral anticoagulants for up to 6 months, provided we repeat imaging and see if the thrombus has disappeared or not. Secondary MR because of ST elevation MI. Now, it can be either early in the process or late. In the acute setting, patient becomes very sick. Patient develops pulmonary edema because the LA is non-compliant. It is not used to the MR. They can be in shock. Okay, so it will be diagnosed by an echo, and then they may have to be sent for surgery. In the late setting, because of LV adverse remodeling, there is LV annular dilatation. The mitral annulus is dilated. The papillary muscles are dysfunctional. So there is a lot of MR, which is what we used to call as this functional or secondary MR. RV dysfunction happens in patients with RVMI, which can be picked up, as I mentioned, with V4R ST elevation has high specificity for that. Patient may be may have a clinically uneventful course, or they can go into this bad triad of hypotension with a clear lung field and increased CAVP. Now, usually the preload has to be increased to a much higher level to achieve good blood pressure in somebody who's got significant RV dysfunction. This is a picture to show how an LV aneurysm has been formed because of an MI. The first picture on the left of the screen, right here, is the true aneurysm. This is a pseudoaneurysm. A true aneurysm has part of the myocardium as a wall, as opposed to a pseudoaneurysm where myocardium is not part of the wall of the pseudoaneurysm. So the risk of rupture with a pseudoaneurysm is much higher than that of a true aneurysm. Heart failure can be a common complication of ST elevation MI. It can just be pulmonary congestion treated with diuretics, or hypotension, or frank shock. Hypotension could be due to many causes, which we have to see whether it's LV or RV dysfunction related. Is it because of arrhythmias, mechanical complications, valve dysfunction, like for example mitral regurgitation, or patient is just hypovolemic, dehydrated? Could be even one of our drugs that we have given. Maybe beta blockers was too early, or the dose was too much, the ACE inhibitor was too much. Cardiogenic shock, there's persistent hypotension defined by cardiac index of less than 2.2 liters per minute per meter square body surface area, and a wedge pressure of more than 18, and an oliguria. Now, first drug of choice would be dobutamine. But if the pressures are very low, some people are concerned about dobutamine falling the diastolic blood pressures precipitously. Noradrenaline is the next drug of choice because the risk of arrhythmias is lower with noradrenaline than with dopamine. And some people, levosimendan is also advocated, especially in those who have been chronically beta blocked, where noradrenaline would not act as well because they have been adequately beta blocked. So levosimendan would be a good choice in such setting. Of course, it doesn't settle with this. Then there is intra-aortic balloon pump, IABP, or other mechanical supports which can be instituted, like LVSS devices and other things. Mechanical complications could be a free wall rupture, septal rupture, or a papillary muscle rupture. Free wall rupture is catastrophic, usually in older age when they have not been reperfused or they've been lysed very late. These are the people who are predisposed to having a free wall rupture. A septal rupture, on the other hand, need not always be very catastrophic, but mortality that it weighs on the patient is much more, no doubt. It can be seen early in the phase of MI or a little delayed after 4 to 7 days. So it has got a biphasic kind of a presentation. People are looking at putting a device like how they would devise a ventricular septal defect or an atrial septal defect versus, of course, sending the patient for surgery. Now, papillary muscle rupture, these are two papillary muscles right here, the anterolateral papillary muscle and the posteromedial papillary muscle. The posteromedial is the one which is more prone to injury, and that is because it's got single blood supply. The anterolateral papillary muscle is supplied by branches from the left anterior descending as well as from the obtuse marginal branches of the left circumflex artery, whereas the posteromedial is supplied by whichever is dominant, either the L6 or the RCA. So because it's a single blood supply, it's more prone for dysfunction. Pericarditis can be early or late. Early pericarditis is very transient usually. Patient complains of pain first day or even second day of the MI, which usually settles down. The late one is what we traditionally call as a Dressler syndrome. It can be diagnosed with any two of the following. Typical chest pain, which is attributed to a pleuritic chest pain, friction rub, ECG changes if it's there, or pericardial effusion. First drug of choice would be aspirin. Colchicine has also been studied in these patients. Now, this is a condensation of what we have seen so far. So I'm just skipping that so that we can go on to NSTEMI and finish it off. I'm not going to go to the details of NSTEMI. I'll probably highlight what's the difference between differences in way we approach it. Now, NSTEMI presentation can be any of the following. Prolonged anginal pain, there's more than 20 minutes of pain at rest, or a patient who has come with angina for the first time. Okay, we have to differentiate this from patient who has had stable angina for all these months or years. Okay, this patient comes, or it could be a recent increase or worsening of the stable angina they had. Patient always could walk 1 kilometer before he developed angina. Over the last week, he says 1 floor and I'm having chest pain and I have to stop. So that's a crescendo angina, or it could be a post-MI angina. So it could be presenting with any of these following. So here we have a diagram which tells us the connection between presentation, ECG, troponin, and the diagnosis, and the likelihood moves from low to high across the horizontal direction. So here is a patient who, for example, presents with very atypical kind of pain, pointing with a finger and saying that my pain is here, no ECG changes, the troponin is negative. Most likely this patient is going to end up in the non-cardiac diagnosis. Here the pain is getting more and more typical. There are ECG changes involved. Troponin is elevated. Patient falls into any of these categories: unstable angina or other cardiac category, or NSTEMI, or even ST elevation MI. So there are numerous conditions where cardiac troponin can be elevated. You just need to remember that MI is not the only thing. Okay, just a tachyarrhythmia which stresses the myocardium can produce troponin elevation. Hypertensive emergencies, it can be elevated. Heart failure, it can be elevated. Myocarditis, Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, dissection, pulmonary embolism, renal failure, so many things where the troponin level can be elevated. So we are going to risk assess the patient, okay, in two different ways. One is the initial risk assessment. The patient presents to us. We know that there are certain factors which upfront worsen the prognosis. Elderly, renal failure, presence of diabetes. These things can, right away you can say that this patient is at a higher risk. Or index hemodynamic status, patient presents with heart failure, or patient presents with shock, then we know that they have a worse prognosis. As far as ECG changes are concerned, ST changes have a worse prognosis compared to T wave changes. Isolated T wave changes do not carry a great increase in mortality, but somehow they bring attention very quickly compared to ST changes. People are not likely to let go of isolated T wave changes, but then ST changes carry a worse prognosis. And biomarkers, if troponin is elevated, patient carries a worse prognosis compared to somebody who presents only with chest pain, maybe plus minus ECG changes without troponin elevation. So we also have to, so based on these, we also have to decide who are the ones we are going to monitor the cardiac rhythm, because which are the ones who are likely to have ventricular arrhythmias or fatal arrhythmias. So we know if the patient is known CAD, patient has got extensive multivessel disease or had revascularization in the past, these kind of patients we would like to monitor their rhythm very closely. And of course, long-term complications also can be predicted by if the patient had a bad clinical course, significant LV dysfunction, AF, severe CAD, these kind of factors which can predict the worse long-term prognosis. Once again, the TIMI score is very useful for predicting the worse outcomes. As you can see, as the number of the score increases from 0 to 7, the outcome also worsens. This is based on a Gray score. So this is two different set of patients. The high-risk patients had a Gray score of more than 140. The low-risk patients had a Gray score of less than 140. We find that whether the patient underwent an early or a delayed PCI strategy, if they were low risk, then they did almost the same, equally well. But in the high-risk category, the ones who had an early PCI did much better than the ones who had delayed PCI. Now this was part of the 2015 NSTEMI guidelines from European Society of Cardiology. This is probably something that is good to know for all of us. So patient presents with chest pain. Okay, patient we have done in troponin, and the troponin is actually normal. Now what is the next thing we look at? If the pain was already 6 hours old or not. If the patient's pain was more than 6 hours, then patient is unlikely to have an acute coronary event. If the Gray score is less than 140, we've excluded other differential diagnosis. This patient can straight away go for a stress testing safely. Okay, they can actually go on a treadmill or any other form of stress testing. But if the patient has got a normal troponin but has come in less than 6 hours of symptom onset, we would like to test them again 3 hours from the baseline. If that is not increased, once again patient falls in the same category. If the 3-hour testing has, on the other hand, if the patient has got a high troponin, if it's markedly elevated, they directly go to invasive management. That is this dotted line here, which takes them to this red box very straight away. If the troponin is elevated, but not markedly elevated, we are going to retest after 3 hours, and that shows a good amount of change. That is this subset, they again go to invasive management. If there is no change, then we want to evaluate and see what is the cause of troponin elevation in this patient. Could be some other form of myocardial injury. So we have to look at differential diagnosis. Now, this is essentially the same thing in different forms and different numbers. We in CMC use this assay called the ELIXIS assay. These are all high sensitivity troponin assays, 5th generation assays. For example, if patient has come and we have done a troponin and the troponin level is very low, A is very low. Now, if the patient has been having more than 3 hours of pain, then we have ruled out ACS. That is, if the patient's troponin is very low. If the patient presents at the baseline troponin is, for example, 12, let's say B, and 1 hour later the troponin has gone up by 3, then the patient is likely to have an acute coronary syndrome. If not, then we have ruled it out. On the other end of the spectrum, patient has come in with a markedly elevated troponin, D, which is for example 52 for this assay, or if the 1 hour change has been more than 5, both ways, we are ruling in an acute coronary syndrome. So in a matter of 1 hour, we should be able to box them into a rule in or a rule out algorithm. This algorithm was also introduced in the 2015 guidelines. So if we have access to a high sensitivity troponin, then within 1 hour we can take a decision as to whether they can go home or they can, or they have acute coronary syndrome or any other cause of their symptoms. So unstable angina patient, we usually do not have to monitor rhythm. So they go to a regular ward, they can get discharged. Low risk for cardiac arrhythmia, STEMI with low risk for cardiac arrhythmias, the rhythm monitoring is done for 24 hours or lesser, and they be in an intermediate unit. Of course, high risk patients will be in an intensive coronary care unit. This is something that helps us to decide which patient goes for invasive strategy. By invasive, I mean they have to be referred for a percutaneous coronary intervention. So there are 4 categories. There's very high risk, there's intermediate risk, there's low risk. I'm just going to look at the high risk first. Patient has got shock or ongoing chest pain despite starting adequate therapy for anti-anginal therapy. Life-threatening arrhythmias or cardiac arrest, mechanical complications like for example MR, mitral regurgitation, acute heart failure, or dynamic STT changes. These patients are categorized as very high risk. What do we do with them? So this patient is very high risk right here, this red box. They go into a immediate invasive strategy in less than 2 hours, something very similar to the primary PCI. If the patient has high risk features but not very high risk features, for example, rise or fall in the cardiac troponin, dynamic STT changes, symptomatic or silent, and gray score which is more than 140, then they go to a high risk box, that is this orange box, and they go to an early invasive. Within the next 24 hours, they are referred for a PCI. If it's an intermediate risk criteria, just having diabetes itself, or renal insufficiency, heart LV dysfunction, early post-infarction angina, if they've had prior CABG or a PCI, or if the grace risk is more than 109 but less than 140, then they go to an intermediate risk where they are referred for PCI in the next 72 hours. If they are low, if they are belonging to the low risk category, that is not any of these, then of course you can treat them medically alone. And take it from there. So what we probably need to remember is there is one category which is high risk, which is like the primary PCI. There's one category which is early invasive, which is next 24 hours. There is just invasive, not early invasive, just invasive, which is 72 hours. And then there is very low risk category. So yes, I think we've almost reached the end of the presentation now.
Any questions about
Those questions?
Yes, have you.
Oh, you have. We have some questions here. Any role of IM morphine or is recommended only for IV morphine? Now, I am not sure the basis of this question, but if I am suspecting myocardial infarction in a patient, I would immediately get an IV line. So IV morphine would be the thing to give. If that is, if you're asking because there's a lack of IV line. But I suppose the IM can be given, but IV dose 2 to 4 mg is what has been written in the recommendation. What is your recommendation for route of unfractionated heparin for STEMI patients diagnosed in? Okay, this is a difficult question to answer. Basically, somebody has asked for the route of unfractionated heparin for STEMI. The recommendation for unfractionated heparin in STEMI patients is an infusion. When we give unfractionated heparin as an infusion, we are expected to monitor APTT. That is very labor intensive, cumbersome, and the APTT tests also become quite make it expensive, the process of giving unfractionated heparin. So if you do have access to low molecular weight heparins, that would be perhaps easier to give. I understand that it's costlier. It's about 600 to 700 per dose, but that would be ideal. Or we'll have to give them infusion of unfractionated heparin because There are times when we follow boluses of IV heparin, which is not recommended anywhere. So we do give sometimes IV heparin, for example, 5,000 units IV heparin Q8H. Recommendation is to give it as an infusion.
Excuse me, sir.
Increase the volume.
Sir, I actually, this is Arnab from Family Medicine in LCCU. I was the one who asked this question about
Morphine.
So, suppose we diagnose the patient in LCCU or in Shalom Hospital, which is just 2 kilometers from the main hospital. So, is there any role of giving an unfractionated heparin, or do we just give the loading dose of statin, aspirin, to and morphine and refer the patient?
Sorry, the voice was quite unclear, but I'm thinking.
Already answered. Morphine and unfractionated heparin is the question he asked. 2 questions.
Okay. Can you just type it down again? Meanwhile, I'll answer the other questions because your voice is not clear. Sorry. Just type it out and we'll answer it again. Doesn't the time duration from when patient experiences pain and first time? Doesn't the time duration from when the patient experiences chest pain and the first diagnosed contact matter? It does matter because, for example, if the patient has come after 12 hours of symptom onset to the patient, to the person who takes the ECG, then directly thrombolysis is out. So in that way it matters. It matters to determine the treatment strategy, but it is not something that we can change. That is what guidelines is trying to say. It's a patient side delay. Unless we increase the awareness in the community and say these could be atypical symptoms, so please do seek medical attention if you develop any of them. Unless we do that, we will not be able to change patient delay. So we have to make sure that our side system delay can be brought down to a minimum. What is your cutoff to say market elevation, sir? Guideline says 52 for Alexis assay. So I would stick to that. Guideline says 52 for Alexis assay, 5th generation troponin. Are statins not indicated for loading dose? Yes, of course. Statins, basically what they're saying is, the guideline saying is, we have to load the patient with the aspirin upfront, 300 milligrams upfront. Clopidogrel, that is the second dose, the second antiplatelet agent, has to be given if the patient is going for primary PCA anytime before the primary PCA. That's either in the, for example, in the emergency or in the lab. Now, atorvastatin has to be initiated within the first 24 hours, is what this European Society of Guidelines has said. So, anytime within the 24 hours. So, we here in CMC give all three at the same time: 300 mg of aspirin, 300 mg of clopidogrel, and 80 mg of atorvastatin at when the patient comes in, and an extra 300 mg of clopidogrel the moment we decide the patient is going for primary PCI. Any role of CT angio or cardiac MRI in acute MI management? CT angio and cardiac MRI have been mentioned in the guidelines. Now, but this should not delay therapy. For example, if the patient has a clear-cut ST elevation, we are obviously going to send the patient for primary PCI. But where there is a doubt, where we are thinking about more in terms of for example, cardiac MRI is very useful in evaluating myocardial injury without ischemia. So, for example, Takotsubo cardiomyopathy or myocarditis. When these are the differentials, cardiac MRI is a wonderful tool. CT angio, on the other hand, in low-risk patients, to rule out CAD, CT angio is wonderful. But if the patient has a higher likelihood of having coronary artery disease, CT angio is not very great test because it is not good to rule in. It's only good to rule out. The more the calcium in the CT, the more difficult the interpretation. So there are a lot of confounders. So CT angio would not be useful in such kind of situations. What is the role of tenecteplase in a witnessed cardiac arrest during resuscitation? Witnessed cardiac arrest. I'm thinking you're talking about out of hospital cardiac arrest. A witnessed cardiac arrest within the hospital, we will hopefully have the rhythm or the ECG to say this is related to heart, this is ischemia related. Now, outside the hospital, we don't know if it's because of an intracranial bleed or something, so I wouldn't recommend, neither do any guidelines recommend giving tenecteplase during resuscitation. What if it is something else? What if it is a large intracranial bleed? So we have to have some evidence to say this is cardiac, either in the form of ECG showing ST elevation, or the suspicion of myocardial ischemia being the cause. That has to be very high. Somebody who was already documented to have coronary artery disease, has had angioplasty in the past or CABG in the past, or has been having significant cardiac symptoms even otherwise, suddenly collapses. These kind of patients, we know that the probability of ACS is very high. Even there, the recommendation is to take them for primary PCI so that the coronary anatomy can be delineated, and then we can decide what needs to be done. Fibrinolytic agent is not recommended in these situations. Now, when we decide to do a primary PCI, the question is, in COVID-19 positive patient with STEMI, how are you managing? So now, for example, now we all know that the spread is very rampant. Patient comes with ST elevation MI. Patient needs to go for a primary PCI. We take full precautions, all the operators, the nursing staff, the technical staff, and then we go ahead with the primary PCI. Now, if the patient is not eligible for primary PCI, by that I mean patient is not ready with the necessary finance or insurance or whatever, patient goes for a fibrinolytic therapy. Once sliced, we test them, and if they need to go for a pharmacoinvasive strategy, then once the test result comes negative, we take them. That is well within 24 hours. If the patient requires to go for a rescue PCI because of failed thrombolysis, once again we treat it like primary PCI. We take full precautions and go ahead and do a PCI. In hospital MI, differentiating type 1 and type 2 MI may be difficult. Would you err on the side of doing an angio if in doubt? There is no doubt in this question. Any MI, if there is ST elevation, needs to go for a PCI. The diagnosis of type 2 MI is made only because we have not seen any thrombus in the angiogram. So if the patient has not gone for angiogram, we are not going to be calling it as a type 2 MI. So inside the hospital, patient has to go for a PCI for sure. The problems with that, I'll tell you, the statement seems very straightforward, but it's not as easy in real life scenario. Patient is admitted for evaluation of aplastic anemia. Patient has a platelet count of 10,000. Patient has developed an MI. What do? Now, primary PCI involves giving high dose heparin plus minus glycoprotein 2B3A inhibitors like tirofiban. There is a high risk of bleeding. We cannot take that chance in this patient. So those are the situations which preclude doing a primary PCI for a patient inside the hospital. But otherwise, all patients in or outside the hospital with ST elevation MI have to get a primary PCI done. That is a recommended therapy. Of course, there are some small subset where this may not. Sorry. There's a small subset of patients where this may not be readily applicable. For example, patient is come with chest pain, but patient has got some terminal malignancy or a very debilitated patient who will not be able to tolerate those kind of antiplatelets or large doses of anticoagulation. Here we'll have to go case by case, but by and large we'll have to offer primary PCI. Is taking aspirin before reaching a hospital recommended? If you have a clue that it is MI, If you have aspirin at home, certainly. It's not part of the recommendation though. It's a very interesting question. In SARS-CoV, what is the pathophysiology of STEMI, thrombus or vasospasm? Now, I think we have, from what we have seen so far, and not here from data from elsewhere, we see a lot of patients with normal angiograms. So I would think that vasospasm would be more likely, but nevertheless, we cannot rule out thrombus in this patient because, even when you don't see visible thrombus, it's possible that the thrombus is migrated down the vessel, spontaneously recanalized vessel. These are all possible. Since we know that it's a prothrombotic state, both are equally possible. If you're sending the patient to us, I suppose you're sending for a primary PCI strategy. You can load the patient with aspirin, clopidogrel, and atorvastatin and send the patient. You don't have to give them heparin there. We will manage the heparin part of it. If you're sending them to GH, well, then of course you can give them the loading dose of heparin and send them because we're not sure as of yet. Primary PCIs are not being done there, so you're sending them for a conservative management strategy. So if you're sending to us, you load them with antiplatelet and statin and send them to us.
No further questions. Over to Kambu, sir.
Nathaniel, thank you very much. We are deeply grateful for you coming and taking the class. It was fantastic, really good. I think it cleared a lot of doubts for everybody. And thank you for staying on till 4:30 and answering questions so patiently. They might have been sounding very elementary for you, but thank you for patiently answering them. We hope to get you back for some more questions, some more sessions in cardiology. And it was a wonderful session. Thank you so very much.
I would like to thank you and the entire department for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for the audience who've been such a wonderful audience. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you, Department of Medicine, for this. I had a nice time.
Okay. Thanks, Nathaniel. Thank you again, Mohan, and to the telemedicine team. Good evening, everybody.